Welcome to the Editor is In podcast. And my name is Anthony James, and I'm editor of Marriage and Family Review. And we have a series of podcasts that we would like to publish regarding the value of reviewing as it relates to scholars in the field. And today we have a guest that is the editor of another journal. So I will pass the virtual mic and allow her to introduce herself.
Great, sounds good. Thanks so much, Dr. James. So hi, all. My name is Dr. Melissa Curran. I'm an associate professor of family studies and human development at the University of Arizona. And then currently, I'm also the editor of the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, or JSPR. That is part of the International Association for Relationship Research, or IARR, all those acronyms, right? So
Right.
I've editor now since 2020, January 2020. And then before being the editor, I was an associate editor for the same journal for the past 5 years. So I have a lot of experience specific to JSPR. I've also been on various editorial boards. So currently I'm still an editorial board member for Family Relations, as well as Journal Family Issues. And then previously I've been an editorial board member for Journal of Family Psychology and Journal of Marriage and Family.
Got it. Got it. So lots of experience. And what we will do is make sure we link your journal alongside this podcast because we want to make sure that folks also, consider submitting to your journal as well. So thanks for being here. And so I have 5 questions which I've shared with Dr. Curran, and we'll just talk through those. And the first question is, what is the value of reviewing from the perspective of the scholar? We certainly want to acknowledge that we as editors we benefit from having a pool of reviewers, but one aspect that may not be well known is like what value does reviewing serve for the scholar? So what are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
these are great questions. Thanks, Dr. James. So the reviewers are so important, right? So when I go through and choose the editorial board, what I do is I look to see how many reviews have people done if they're already, recorded, their names and information is recorded in the system. So the number of reviews they've done, as well as the quality of reviews and then the timeliness of reviews. All of those things make a big difference, right? So we really could not be academics without our editorial board members,